Hi, I'm Jack, and today we're going to be doing an Alla Prima portrait. Alla Prima portraits essentially just mean in one. So you're painting wet into wet, getting all the information down in one sitting. These kind of portraits tend to be slightly smaller, they tend to be a little bit less detailed and sometimes a little bit more sort of characterized in the sense of potential exaggerations to sort of emphasize a likeness. However, because these kind of shorter format portraits are fantastic not only as an academic practice, just to sort of get your eye flowing, to help you start to use the paint a little bit more confidently, but also they can be fantastic for head studies for larger compositional works, for just understanding your model's facial structures before you head on to a larger, more sort of detailed and longer pose painting. However, because today this is a portrait where I'm not going to be revisiting it on a larger scale or doing a huge amount more after this sitting, I'm going to use it more as a sort of as a gestural piece. So I'm looking possibly less for trying to really capture necessarily a really specific likeness, but looking more for the sort of the gesture and the life of a pose of a portrait. So because this painting is done in a lot shorter time frame, I'm going to be looking less for the sort of formality of a portrait and looking for more of the gesture and the sort of life and breadth of the pose. So I'm going to be painting a little bit broader. I'm going to be focusing a little bit less on trying to get every specific intricacy and characterization of our model, and I'm looking more for the sort of general idea that we're getting from the pose. So if anything, I'm looking less for copying exactly what I'm seeing, and I'm more using what I'm seeing as a guide, as a reference to create an interesting, lively sketch or short form painting. So because I'm looking for something a little bit less formal, what I'm going to do quickly is show you how potentially I would set up a longer pose painting in relation to how I'm going to set up this shorter, more sort of gestural painting. So for a more formal commissioned painting or something, maybe you would have a little bit more upright, a little bit more sort of interaction directly to the viewer, to the artist. Whilst with this painting, I'm going to get our model to look down a little bit. It's got really nice, high, pronounced cheekbones, so we can get a really nice angle down towards the jaw. And I'm going to get quite a strong, dramatic light effect, and I've got that by using this spotlight. We could use windows, which unfortunately, because it's winter and it's a rather grey day today, that might not translate beautifully on camera, so we're going to use the spotlight today. So either one works. There is no definitive right or wrong. You'll find that if you're using natural light, there is more variation. There are more changes, which has its pros and its cons, in the sense that things will move. There is more difficulty in the sense that you're not always going to be looking at exactly the same thing. However, the natural movement and variation of light gives us a huge amount of sort of opportunity to pick and choose what we're looking for and what we're getting, and gives this lovely sort of naturalism to the painting. But we're going to go for a little bit more of the sort of solid light source today for this painting. So just so that I'm not working straight onto this bright white canvas, I'm going to put an imprimatura on, just to sort of tone down the canvas, so I'm working on essentially a neutral mid-tone. So I'm going to use a bit of raw umber, and I'm just going to essentially rub a thin layer of that over my canvas, nice and evenly, with a tiny bit of turpentine to get a sort of even base to work on. Now when you're doing this, it's important not to use too much terps or to have too much oil, because then obviously you're going to battle against that when you're putting paint down. So I'm just scrubbing in to get this darker sort of essentially mid-tone, which is also far closer to the tone on my palette. So actually what I'm mixing in my palette should be easier to transfer straight onto my canvas without there being too much of a sort of visual jump in how I perceive the tones. So really making sure I'm getting off any excess oil or turpentine, and it's just to kill that white of the canvas. There we go. Like with the grisaille, I'm just going to start off by mixing a very basic and very generalized shadow tone and light tone. So my shadow tone, and I'm using essentially a Zorn palette here. So that's ivory black. I've got some Chinese vermilion, but you could use cadmium red, some yellow ochre, and some lead white replacement. Again, you know, I think with the whites you can use whichever white you want. You can use titanium, zinc, lead white, or the lead white replacement. My personal preference is lead white, but my stocks are running slightly short at the moment, so we're on the replacement at this point. So for my shadow tone, I'm essentially grouping these three, and for my light tone, I'll group these three. And so once again, it's really important to lay your palette out in a nice, clear, simple manner. That way I can keep my darks on this side and go from darkest dark down to my lightest light. And so you're mixing and adding colours closest to those pools of tone that you want. And although it seems fairly obvious, is use separate brushes for your lights and your darks. I know it sounds incredibly sort of obvious, and why wouldn't you do that? But you'll be amazed how many people get halfway through a painting and then they've only used one brush, which just makes everything a lot harder for them, because you end up with this muddied, very sort of unclear mess on your palette. So for my light source, for my generalized light, going for predominantly the white for the light part. Then you have more ochre. We've got quite a nice olivey skin, and then a little bit of red, sort of warm it up a touch, and to make sure it's not too ochre-y. And what's quite nice is certainly, so this palette is more of a sort of European Caucasian skin tone palette, but well, I mean, that's where it originated from. It's where you find the majority of artists in Europe would be using this palette, because predominantly their subjects were Caucasian or lighter skinned people. So I'll be using these three for my generalized light, and these three for my generalized dark. And you can already see how, as I'm mixing, I'm starting to sort of get that transition from my lightest light to my generalized mid-tone, and it will then transfer and end up with this almost sort of rainbow effect of dark tone to lighter tone. The medium I'm going to use, I'm going to start off by painting relatively thinly and relatively dry, because I just want enough medium just to help the paint flow without it becoming difficult to then work over. So again, starting off with big, very generalized straights to just try and compose where I want the head on the canvas. But I'm just going to be using a stand oil for this portrait, which is a little bit thicker, it's a little bit gloopier. That's a personal preference of mine. If you like a little bit of a sort of thinner medium, maybe something like a linseed oil, sort of cold pressed is going to essentially just add more oil to your paint mix. So the first kind of things I do, just with my generalized shadow tone, is just really roughly map out those larger shadow shapes. Again, you're sort of building it up as if you're recognizing someone from across the street. So you're going sort of silhouette, larger shadow shapes, then you're going to start honing in on more detail. But again, really just focusing on the moment, general placement, keeping it pretty broad. You know, all these marks putting down at the moment. Whoop. Always make sure your easel is nice and tight. Otherwise, things fall around and slip. So really squinting and simplifying those shadow shapes to a point where they're almost sort of overly generalized on this. And there are two kind of ways of going about it. What you can do is you can go in, really draw those shadow shapes, get them as specific as possible, and then mass in. For a longer pose portrait, that's definitely something which I would do. For these quicker, more sort of gestural paintings, you know, I quite like, you know, almost having something emerge out of the sort of broader mess. And I'm just getting a real rough indication for where things are, and then I'm going to hone in on them. So for Alla Prima, my personal, and this is a very personal thing, it's always quite a personal thing, is get something down, then edit what you've got down. Whilst others will spend much more time honing in, getting those shapes. But like I say, today I'm not focusing that much on a very specific likeness. Obviously, I'll try and get as much of a likeness as I can, but it's not going to be my primary focus. I'm using him very much as a model rather than it being necessarily a portrait of him. And certainly, you know, because you're being a little bit bolder with getting sort of paint and these larger sort of shapes down early on, is you might think that your shadow tone is is darker than it actually is at this point, and that's perfectly sort of normal. But you'll probably find, you know, it's not. You have plenty of leeway to go quite dark quite early. But quite early on, you can see I'm just trying to get that sort of general structure of the head through that sense of light and dark, and really simplifying the shadow shapes. And I really don't mind at this point, because I want to keep quite a sort of broad, loose sense of focus to this portrait. I don't mind if we get a little bit of softness coming through as we move things around, because ultimately that's the effect I'm going to be looking for by the end of it. And as always, even at this sort of early stage, is use the right size brush for the mark you want to make. As you can see, trying to be big, broad, be quite loose with it. Essentially be happy to sort of jump in and drown a little bit when it comes to the painting. You know, don't spend too much time sort of tiptoeing around the baby pool. Bear in mind, this is an Alla Prima painting. Ultimately, the fact that it's an Alla Prima painting gives you so much more freedom and leeway to be a little bit more experimental with it. Because you know how much detail and intricacy are we really expected to get within, 3 hours or however long your sitting may be. So embrace the process, enjoy the process. I think that's the sort of key thing. I think what you've always got to remember, certainly in a time nowadays where we're sort of bombarded by these quite manicured versions of people's practices, is that there's a lot of works made by every artist I know which either get put straight in the bin, painted over. So don't be afraid to give it a go and for it not to go brilliantly. And actually, to be honest, by having that freedom, by not worrying too much about the idea of every painting you're doing have to be perfect, you'll find you actually will create far more successful paintings because you're able to sort of release yourself from that pressure. I think it's always sort of good to sort of keep in mind for every one painting you see posted on Instagram, there's probably about 10 lying on the floor in tatters. And so really don't worry. So although we're being broader and we're maybe not spending quite as much time really fussing over those shapes, the way we're building up is exactly the same. We're building up through editing those initial marks we put down. I think certainly with an Alla Prima portrait, it is very much a case of we should be thinking more, rather than how much information can I get down within 3 hours, it's what information do I need to get down? What information is needed to describe something? Often less is more. So you may have noticed when I showed you my palette earlier that I didn't have any sort of real pre-mixtures down. And certainly with an Alla Prima, I like to keep everything quite sort of reactionary when it comes to my paint mixes. Because as I said, I don't want to be totally constrained by the realities of the tones and colours I'm seeing. I want to be inspired, informed and motivated by it, but you're not a slave to nature. Essentially, you're interpreting it. So don't be afraid to sort of, if you think something's nicer with the odd change, give it a go. Sweet. I'll give you a crown of thorns in the end.
There you go.
So one thing which I always think is sort of so key, and something which I always say to any student I've got, is always feel as if the brush is doing the work rather than you. So yes, we're working with slightly thinner paints at the moment, but if you ever feel like you're the one having to really push the paint onto the canvas, off the brush, you probably don't have enough paint on your brush. So at this point, I'm still working pretty much with those very generalized tones. Basically still working with the two midtones. Every now and again, mixing a little bit more and potentially adding tiny bits of variety to it, but ultimately still very much within the thing of keeping it as simple and broad as possible. Essentially, you're painting with midtones. And what you do find often is both those midtones can probably end up getting a little bit darker as you get further on painting. But let's not worry about that at this point. Just keep going in, honing the shapes, trying to get that sort of gestural look. So with Alla Primas, I tend, again, a little bit more of a personal preference, but to be a little bit more aware of the sort of stereotypes of lighting and sort of tone and hue. For example, as a general thing, you probably have it's a little bit whiter, a little bit sort of cooler, then probably gets a little bit warmer around the cheeks, and then tends to get a little bit cooler, a little bit sort of bluier as you head down towards the chin. this is something where I only sort of, it's more of, I guess, a subconscious addition to these faster paintings, but I think it's something which every now and again it's probably quite nice to just double check whether your painting is going sort of far away from those stereotypes. Another kind of stereotype or generalization rather than stereotype as such, is looking at stuff like where the mouth, or the outside corner of the mouth is going to line up in relation to the eyes. So you find for someone looking straight forward, the corners of the mouth tend to line up pretty much where the pupils are. Again, giant generalization, and all models are different. Some people have wider mouths or eyes which are closer or wider apart. But I think it's one of those things where if you find you are too far away from that generalization, it's something where you may want to just double check what you've got down to see, because it's more sort of finding, an average placement. So now I've got sort of very generalized shape in, I'm going to start pushing those tonal values a little bit more. It's just going to help me see the shapes a little bit better. Felt like I was having to do a bit too much work to get the paint off the brush there, so just adding more paint, mixing a bit more. Starting to hit those tonal values a little bit better. And again, still keeping it super broad and generalized. I always find it quite sort of amusing at this point, where you've got a rough indication of the shadows, of the shapes of the head. I always find that the painting always starts to resemble one sort of famous character or person completely unrelated to your subject. So I give myself a bit of a game to potentially make my painting look a little bit less like Freddie Mercury. But that's not something to worry about. It's only a little bit of a concern for your painting. So again, once you're relatively happy with the shapes, start to establish your value range. I've hit my darkest dark a little bit more, which is the hair. And now I need to put in some indications for the highlights. And I know I'm going to move these highlights around. I know I'm going to soften them, put loads more paint in and around them. So I'm not being... It's more just about placements, making sure that the relationships between the placements of the highlights are working. So at this point, the highlights don't have the variation or variety that they will later on. But I can already see now that I've put that highlight in, is the forehead is a little bit too large on my painting. So I'm going to have to introduce a little bit more of the hair, a little bit lower. It gives me an opportunity to, with some bit thicker paint, and start to sort of paint that transition a bit more. So, like with the grisaille, like with the longer pose painting, we always go back, refine those shadow shapes, make sure that they're starting to make a little bit more sense, because each time we put information down, it's going to change how we see. And I think certainly if you started quite broad like we have, it's really important to just keep going back, keep checking, keep essentially building that likeness. What I'm doing now is really starting to look at those planal shifts in the head to help me structure. Certainly with this way I've got a little bit more of a tilt on the head, so it's not that sort of symmetrical, simple pose. You want to really look at the relationships of elements of the head. So when I'm essentially drawing or reshaping those external contours or interior marks, I'm still working with straights. It's only when I'm essentially massing in am I becoming a little bit more freer and looser when it comes to those sort of geometric elements of it. And as you can probably see, 90% of the work which has been going on so far has been either a contour edge or a shadow edge. And a lot of that is pushing and pulling the shadow edge, and sometimes even just starting to turn it by mixing a mid-tone and placing that next to that transition. Again, at this point, I'm pretty sure 90% of what I've got down is going to be covered again before the end of the session. So I'm not being overly precious, but I want every mark I make to essentially be a step towards that finished painting. So whilst I'm still being loose and broad, is that the marks are observed and thought of. They're not being put down for the sake of it. But of course sometimes you pick up the wrong brush, make a rogue mark, which is definitely not towards that final goal, that these things happen. So I'm starting to use slightly smaller brushes as I go into these shadow shapes. I'm using probably bigger brushes than, again, what I would on on a longer time frame, mainly because I want to have, I've got an idea of the aesthetic which I want to have at the end, and I want to have this nice, soft focus portrait or head study. So I'm not particularly worried or concerned about going slightly over, blurring some edges as I work, because I always back myself, and I think this is key. You've always got to back yourself to be able to refine it, to be able to paint it again. If you don't do that, if you stop backing yourself, you become precious with the marks you've got down and you hinder yourself massively. Remember, a lot of painting is failing with confidence. I think that's, and I don't mean that in the sense of, every artwork you make is going to be a failure. It's more that there's always going to be something which someone or you can look at in your painting and go, that potentially could be better. I can improve on this. I can do that. Embrace that. If you can see that, that means you're learning, essentially. If you look at your painting, you think, I don't think how I can ever get better than this. This is the perfect painting. Probably say you're slightly deluded, because I just don't think that exists. It's not a slight on your painting ability. So I want so much of this painting to be described through the placements of the highlights. I want to keep my lights pretty simple, my shadows pretty simple, a really interesting gesture on the head, and have those highlights to be as descriptive as possible. That's what I'm aiming for in this painting. So I guess we'll see if I'm successful on that. Fingers crossed. But I think it's always good to have a rough idea. You don't have to, it can change as you're painting, as you're developing the work on the canvas. But have a rough idea of what the end goal is to look like, is to be. And ultimately, it will change. It's not going to be exactly how you perceived it in your mind's eye at the beginning of the painting. But it's always good to have an idea of a sort of, I guess, a stylistic finish point which you're aiming for. Now I can see that highlight I've just put down on the cheekbone is already too light. Bear in mind, when you're looking at highlights which are surrounded by darker areas, they are going to appear lighter than they are in reality. Just keep that in mind when you're painting them. Remember, it's an Alla Prima. It's a little bit like a self-portrait in the sense that it gives you the freedom to experiment, to play around, to explore paint, explore the possibilities of paint. Obviously, you're exploring the more in a direct wet on wet style, but play around with mark making a little bit, play around with your your personal calligraphy when it comes to paint, because I think what we don't want to do is be forcing ourselves to be stuck in a box really early on in our artistic career just because we played it safe each time we painted. If it doesn't go to plan, the painting never really has to see the light of day afterwards. So something which is really important if you're doing something with a tilt of the head is making sure the peak of the head works with the tilt. If it doesn't, the tilt isn't going to work, and you're going to end up with this slightly garbled anatomy of the top of the head. So at this point now I've started to get more paint down. What I can also do is start to manipulate the paint I've already got on the canvas. And again, this is something which you'd normally do if you're working on a larger project towards the end of a session, but I'm going to start incorporating this a lot earlier on in the process. So, and a lot of that is because, I don't know if it's a subconscious thing, but because you've got a little bit less time, is you tend to start slapping down the paint a little bit earlier in an Alla Prima, and a little bit more confidently than what most would when it comes to a longer pose painting. So you actually have the ability to then manipulate that paint a bit more. And when I start doing that, which I haven't yet, I'm still going to be adding more paint around it, but I'm also going to be essentially softening stuff which is on the canvas already. So, for example, getting a nice soft brush. I know I want the top of the brows to be nice and soft, so I can just essentially start to shape and mould them a little bit more. Same with the eyes. I can almost start pushing some of the light in and around the eye to get a sense of those whites of the eyes, just by softening it round at this point. And then of course I'm going to re-hit them a little bit later. But again, this works a little bit more when you know that you're going for that soft focus finish. If you wanted a very sharp, drawn finish to your painting, this probably wouldn't be advisable at this point. So, horses for courses. And I might even just use my finger in certain places to really soften an edge. Again, something probably not overly advisable due to the fact that most of you are using turpentine or some toxic element to one of your paints. So if you are to use your finger, maybe wear gloves. But I'm fully aware that my lack of road safety will probably get me before the poisoning. So really important on a portrait where there's a slight tilt, where you don't have that frontal or more clear straight across, is that stuff like the cheekbones, the eyes, the angle of the nose and the mouth are all working along the same angle, so you don't have a disconnect in the turn or direction of the head. So at this point I'm starting to create a little bit more variety around the edge, and then you will find as I start to build up some of those more central elements. But 90% of the work, or the focal point of what I'm doing is again still on the shadow or contour edge. And you can kind of see what I've started to do already is I want to exaggerate the turn of the neck to create a little bit more of a dynamic portrait. So I've really almost overhit the sternocleidomastoid coming down from behind the ear to what the base of the neck is going to be. Raise the shoulder to give more of a sense to turn, so you're going to see a little bit more of the trapezius. And I think just having a little bit more, and that's one of those kind of moments where you can think, okay, how can I make my painting more interesting? Where, you know, you're essentially manipulating nature to sort of suit your goal. So as I'm working up these edges, I know that the tonal values might start to get a little bit changed, so I constantly need to go and refresh my value range, refresh my highlights, re-hit my darkest dark, make sure that everything is still working in the manner which I want it to. And as always, stuff like the hairline can be so much softer than what you think. You almost want a sort of sense of sort of transparency through that hairline, the fact that you're seeing through those first couple of layers of hair. Sometimes you find when you're trying to keep something broad, trying to keep, you know, a more wider focus on the painting, is people are hesitant to start picking up those smaller brushes. But just because you're broad doesn't mean that you can sort of become any less specific when it comes to some of the marks you want to make. So being sort of around, possibly over sort of midpoint of this portrait, I want to be starting to use more paint, starting to paint a little bit more opaquely. At this point we should have an idea of where things are, where we want our marks, what we're aiming for. So I can tell from here I want to characterize those eyes a little bit more, characterize the shape of the mouth, shape of the chin a little bit more. I can keep them nice and soft whilst doing that, but it is just about just making sure the marks which you do have down, which are more prominent, are in the right spot. So even with a sort of time limited painting, I'm spending as much time, if not more, analysing, viewing, making my judgments of what I want to do, making my plan before then putting paint to canvas. Again, it's still about being sort of efficiently lazy with the strokes you're putting down. You want them to be as efficient, and not like that one, as possible. And once again, you know, it's something which sounds incredibly obvious, but you'll be amazed how many people don't do it, is if you come and you put a mark down and you realise that's the wrong colour and the wrong tone, don't keep going with that colour and tone. Edit it, fix the problem. So, but you'll be amazed at people who sort of continue to almost paint a whole area with something which they know to be the wrong colour or tone. So just make sure that you're not doing that, and it'll make life a lot easier for you on that front. In many ways, painting, certainly sort of Alla Prima painting, because of the limitations you have, is so much about just doing the simple things. correct. Painting often is, in essence, is far simpler than many people think. The problem is actually to keep it simple, to keep it as sort of basic as you can, is the tricky thing. It's very much about doing the simple things as well as you possibly can, rather than let's try and overcomplicate it and do as much as possible because of some sort of embedded desire for there to be a untold secret to how everything's done. It is, unfortunately, more about grafting through those more stressful and frustrating moments and making sure and repeating that what you're doing is getting closer every time to your final goal. Again, it's just quite basic things which people tend to have a habit of over-exaggerating, is the indentation around the eye socket. And most of the time, it's a lot more subtle than what you think. Because bear in mind that actually what you're seeing is a zygomatic bone or zygomatic arch essentially wrap around the back of the underside of the eye socket. So you're not going to see this sort of huge divot, which a lot of people do put in. You want to try and almost envision it wrapping round the sort of the underside of the brow, rather than seeing it as, I know there's an indentation between the cheekbone and the brow. And I think what's so important when you're painting stuff like eyes and around the mouth is to think of it rather than where is the eye, it's where is the structure of the eye socket. And once you get that, you find that the eye sort of falls into place a lot easier. It's slightly like sort of dropping an egg into a frying pan, but you need to find the frying pan first. It's a really bad analogy, that one, but but if you get the eye socket correct, or as correct as you can, the eye's not going to start wandering sort of all over the shop, which it can do if you haven't found the underlying structure of the eye socket first. So personally, my sort of approach to anatomy of the face is predominantly visual, and then you're backing it up with some sort of, ultimately all you really need is some relatively basic knowledge of anatomy to back up what you are seeing. Obviously, if you were to then be editing nature a lot more heavily, to a point where the model is, very much a sort of a loose reference point rather than something a little bit closer to what we're seeing, like we're trying to do today, then a little bit more of a sort of in-depth look into the anatomy is going to be incredibly helpful. But a lot of it is just sort of realizing what that sort of underlying structure, all the features, all the light shapes are going to be sat on. So on something like this, where I've suddenly, by putting this in, really pushed all my, my darkest dark quite considerably, and it's thrown a lot of what I've done previously off. So whilst I'm still going to have it darker than what it was, I think I've probably gone a little bit too dark for essentially the world I've created on my canvas. I know that this isn't that sort of 100% true to life. We are heading towards nature rather than sort of copying it exactly in this study. So again, as long as everything works within the world you're creating, that's the key element of it all. So another thing which I see so regularly, which I think really holds back a lot of people's work, is they can do this beautiful head study, which then there is no thought or observation on how the head connects and relates to the shoulders. And essentially, anatomically, there's only a sort of, for the neck's relationship to the shoulders, there aren't that many things to really need to sort of worry about too much. Essentially, you have sternocleidomastoid, which basically goes from back of the ear down to the base of the neck, the start of the clavicles. You have the trapezius, which is going to get that sort of, which is coming from, again, back of the neck, sort of round here, comes down and around over the shoulders. So that's where you get these nice sort of curves coming down. And to get those two really sort of observed just means that the relationship between the head and the body is going to work so much better, and you're not going to end up with this sort of Guess Who style or Cluedo style figure where you have a head and then just this sort of weird slopey ambiguity. And then it's just basically describing where the base of the neck is. Often that is as much with essentially a very subtle highlight as to, and same when you're describing the clavicles, often it is the highlight which describes it rather than adding a half tone. So really look at, okay, how is this described in nature? I think there is a tendency for people to always try and describe by adding more tone rather than necessarily, or when I say by adding more tone is by getting darker. Whilst I think often it is more about finding a nice subtly placed highlight. Let's put, just going to hint at the shirt with placement of the collar essentially. And I'm going to blend or darken the background. So you've got the shirt and background, very similar colour. I'm doing them as the same colour, but using a slight tonal shift to describe the contour. What I need to do now is I need to re-hit those highlights, get them to sing a little bit more. Then I can go in, refine stuff like the eyes a touch, tip of the nose. Find those sort of darker accents which are going to really push this portrait to the next level. Finding where the moustache sort of folds over and is pushed around by the philtrum, because that often shows me where those darker elements or lighter elements of the moustache is going to be. I said it's often describing the base of the neck and the clavicle is with the highlight. It's the same principle with the lower lid. Often the lower lid is described with a subtle highlight rather than having to sort of draw a sort of lash line from both the upper and lower lid. And certainly on something like this where there's very little detail in the painting, getting the hierarchy of highlights is going to be so important. So that highlight I just put on the nose, I know is a little bit too much of a little dot. Also it's too bright, it's a little bit too white. There's a little bit more redness to it. So I've got to find how it sits, how it softens off. I want it to work in the same way that it does in nature. Like I said earlier, it's highlights surrounded by darks are going to appear to our eyes a lot brighter than they actually are. So be wary of that before putting sort of massive bings of light on the upper lid, or potentially, how light really do we think the light on the highlight on the lower lip is. See, I think even that's too bright, and you can see that it's pulling that lip a bit too far forward. Often when you talk and look about highlights, it's highlights, but highlights comparatively to what's around it. That's what makes it jump. So when I was talking about comparative highlights, the highlight on that lower lid, a bit too big, a bit too low, and actually I could probably maybe even push the dark of the eye very slightly out on that side. What I want to get with the mouth is find out really where it's turning away from the light source and where it's softer. So as it gets around the corner here, really starts to sort of tuck in towards the moustache, so that's going to get darker, it's going to blend into the moustache a lot more. As it comes up to the sort of top of the Cupid's bow, it's a lot lighter, softer, because we're getting a lot more direct light to it. So that's something I've got to try and mimic a little bit more successfully, whilst also maybe introducing a little bit more colour to that lower lip. So whilst I want the lips soft and very much a sort of, well, not even a secondary focus really, but you need to get the shape and the understanding of them correct. So there's a sort of definitely a mid-ground between sort of simplification and an oversimplification of the, well, you don't want to avoid, you want to avoid oversimplification. You just want it not to become a focal point. And if you can essentially get into the habit of, when you're painting, giving as much attention and sort of thought to something which ultimately you want to be incredibly soft and subtle, as to, you know, your sharper, more in-focused elements, you're going to create a really nice, well-observed painting. But we often do get, I guess, a little bit lazy and think, well, no one's really going to be looking at that. So often, as you're painting, you find you start to lose the structure of what you're painting. So it's always good to go back, re-find, and re-establish. And sometimes it's going to be quite nice and easy, other times it's going to take a little bit more work. So, but often, ultimately, sometimes you don't quite know how much of a shift it's going to need to be until you start making those adjustments. So I think it's important to just sort of, once you spot a mistake, is to go in and change it nice and early, don't linger too much on it. But even with an Alla Prima, something you're not spending a huge amount of time with, having something to refresh your eye is so important. So if you've got a mirror, get your mirror out, have a look, double check what you've got down. Make sure that it's making sense, it's working, and if not, you know, remedy it before it becomes a bigger issue. Like I said earlier, if it's not going well, that's not, that's not an issue. Don't worry if it slightly sort of doesn't go to plan. The key thing is always backing yourself to be able to change things, to make it better, and to give it a go. If you don't give it a go, you're not going to learn to adapt to those sort of situations. Whilst even if you give it a go, make a complete hash of it, ultimately you're going to learn something from that experience. And always remember that essentially, a learning curve is not a straight line. It's a sort of mountain range of peaks and troughs as you're slowly climbing up. So not everything is going to go perfect every time. And it's not going to feel like you're making a definitive improvement every painting you do. But what it will do is each painting you do, you will learn something. And that's the key thing. So now going back in, trying to find those sharps and softs in the mouth, now that I've decided I need to lift it up. So lifted it up, and now got to go in and re-find those little darker accents. As well as those softer edges. And for me, one thing to remember with the mouth is, really look at how much something is curving or how little something is curving. Because often we can overdo how much the mouth or how little the mouth does curve. So really look at where the outside corner of the mouth is and try and characterize them just a little bit more. So still really trying to see this as just a study of light rather than much else. It's a study of light on a head rather than... So I need to re-hit those highlights on the forehead, re-establish my lightest light, because at the moment, highlight on those, very much overtaking what should be our brightest bright, which is around here. And what's quite nice is we have the high contrast with the hair next to it, so that should help me out. Now, I've got to really squint and analyse how light or dark the highlights on the cheekbone are. Are they highlights, or do I just have to darken the halftones around them? I would say, certainly in relation to the highlight on the forehead, I can probably get away with just slightly darkening the halftone around them. First of all, let's just soften that down. I want to introduce a little bit more of the local colouring, although I want to keep the head very simple when it comes to colour variation. We know that the cheek is, whoa, that's oily. Not that the cheek is oily, but the cheek is a little bit reddier. And has that sort of hint of rouge. And then I can slightly clean up and re-hit that. Which again, not quite in the right spot, probably a little bit bright. So it gives me the opportunity to sort of soften the dark into it a little bit whilst pushing it closer to the desired position. And then last couple of things I want to do, I want to make the ear a little bit more clear and play around with the hairline just a touch more. This is too sharp. I quite like the little sharp of the hair sat on top. The ear just seems incredibly muddled. And so those are the things which I'm going to do before calling this one a day. Now I just want to hint at the ear with the lights, but that light initially was way too big. So just trying to essentially re-find it. Really look at where I am actually seeing some light and where I'm not. And then I've got to slightly organise this eye. And a lot of that is just going to be softening it into place a bit more. So with a nice soft bristle brush, I'm going to really start thinking, okay, where do I want him looking? Making sure both eyes are looking in that spot, because it's very easy when you're doing a portrait, any kind of portrait, to inadvertently gift your sitter with a lazy eye. And from personal experiences, clients tend not to want that as an addition, even if you offer it for free. Now, be careful when you do this that you don't lose the shape and you don't essentially change what you've got down. So it's always good to, whilst you're doing it, constantly be going back, double check, because you don't want to finish and then realise that you've completely changed something you worked hard to find. So towards the end of your sitting, you just want to be thinking, okay, what do I want to achieve? How can I get my painting to a point where it is as effective at achieving that as possible? And that can be done in many ways, but I think it's always good at the end of a painting to go back, look at edges, atmosphere, and introduce a couple of accents to pull a sense of focus into certain areas. And certainly with an Alla Prima, you can go a little bit, you've got leeway to go a little bit more jazzy than you would, let's say, in a longer pose formal painting. So you can slightly use more expressive, gestural, sort of exciting marks to pull, as much as pulling the viewer's attention towards an element. You can also kind of keep that in mind and think, okay, well, I want to pull it away from an element as well. If there is an element of the portrait, you want to potentially have slightly less attention drawn to it. But I always sort of would say, keep those things as restrained as possible, because you don't want to essentially, in an attempt to be a little bit more flamboyant with your painting, is undermine all the work you've done for the last however many hours. So use it sparingly and wisely. So I'm going to have one last little play around with top of the brows. I might once again go very quickly back into the tip of nose, which I was just playing around with. But I think with an Alla Prima, there's always something which you can probably decide can get better, more specific, more accurate, softer, sharper. So I think when you feel you are starting to get niggly, that's my advice would be, that's when you should potentially start to think about how to sort of wrap it up a little bit. So just putting in a couple of darker accents. And now use a nice smaller brush, smaller soft brush, soften the last few of those edges to create a nice sort of finished article. So for me, if I'm looking at this part of the brow, it's actually incredibly soft. But whilst doing this, I'm also realizing I don't have much paint down there. So rather than softening it by sort of manually smudging, got to mix that half tone and plop that in, which often actually looks better, but is slightly more work. So it's starting to get a little bit of lift off here, which also might suggest that this is a good spot to leave it, because yeah, I'm just taking more off than I'm putting down on this one. So with that in mind, I'm going to call it a day here. Thank you very much for joining me for this Alla Prima portrait. Oh, okay.